And that looks like about it for the business meeting. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce Jonas here. Jonas has been doing bonsai for a very long time. I'm sure most of you guys know who he is, have heard of him at least. He is one of the founders of the Pacific Bonsai Expo and runs the website Bonsai Tonight. He has a blog on there as well. So we're very lucky to have him here tonight, and he's always a great presenter. So I'll hand it over to him from here.
So today we want to talk a little bit about bonsai design, and bonsai is theoretically and if not artistic, then at least aesthetic pursuit. How many of you have been taught how to make a bonsai look? So it's an aesthetic pursuit, and maybe one person in the hand tentatively raised her hand, maybe 1.5 people. Yeah. Are we just doing horticulture? It's interesting. Let's try this a totally different direction. How many of you can describe what makes a bonsai look like a bonsai in one sentence? Semicolons are acceptable. Straightforward, right? What's the answer? A bonsai looks like a bonsai in that it... Oh, so it's topiary. Topiary shaped like a tree. That's what bonsai is, right? I can make a natural looking topiary. It's not totally straightforward, is it? A miniaturized tree with great character, unless it's an actual sized tree like a collected Sierra juniper that's not meant to be a miniature. Ideally, it suggests some effort put into it. Different from a miniature tree that still has great character. I like that you include the character in that. That's a very important part of it. All of this to say, yeah, it isn't a container, and that's a really good starting point. So we're not allowed to do them on slabs? Look at there. Literally, the derivation of the etymology comes from that. So all of this to say that it's funny, for all of the work we do on bonsai, all of the workshops, all of the lectures, it doesn't come up very often, any guidance whatsoever about how to make a tree look. Peter in Japan, did you guys spend 1 second talking about what makes a bonsai look like a bonsai? Or did you just make bonsai that look like bonsai? Yes, even Peter's thinking about this after 2.5 years in Japan. There are not a lot of conversations on the topic. And so what I want to do tonight is introduce just a couple of the many topics related to bonsai design. I would say there will be a quiz afterwards, but it's actually harder than a quiz. And so the way we're going to do it is the first part of the program, we're going to talk about one of the core concepts in bonsai, which is flow or movement. And then after the break, we are going to I'm not going to do this. You all are going to have a chance to design trees based on some starting points. And yes, I have handouts and quizzes and even clipboards and pencils, so there's no excuse not to participate. When you display a tree, how do you know if the tree goes over here or if it goes over here? Why did whoever set this up put the tree over on your left? Your left. Why is it over there? General flow. Flow typically involves movement. I don't see, this looks static to me. So by heavier, you mean if I pick it up, one of my arms is going to get more tired than the other? What, heavier? Looks heavier. Did I eat too much today, or is this not a flattering look? So notice we don't even have the words to describe adequately. Looks heavy is the best we can do. Any other ideas about why this tree is over on this side instead of on this side? Or should it be over on this side or in the middle? Yes. Uh-huh. So other than cascades, all bonsais move left. And when you say point, does it have fingers? Pointing is a verb, to point. So how is this pointing, this static object? Uh-huh. So this thing down here you're talking about, that kind of secondary trunk and or branch, whatever it is. That's right. And so notice how many more words it takes to start to come to a concept of what we mean by movement or flow. And I agree, that is what's making us put the tree on this side, because we lack better words than to be able to say that this trunk is kind of pointing in this direction to your right. And so we'll talk a lot more about that. Is the first slide up? And the way we'll do this is we'll look at a whole bunch of sample pictures and kind of break down. There are actually 4 or 5 different ways in which trees can indicate flow or movement. And we will look at some of those right here. Excellent. Look at that. Beautiful tree. Thank you, Bob. Which way does this tree flow? To your left? And why? I hear murmurings. Primary branch and apex. Those are nouns. Are there verbs that go with those nouns? All trees have primary branches and apex. They flow. You're exactly right, but it's funny when you actually start breaking it down, and we wonder why beginners struggle with designing trees if the people that have been doing this for 20, 30 years are trying to figure it out, because it's not totally straightforward. What's the next slide look like? Here's one indicator of flow. Pay attention to where the tip top of the tree sits in relation to the base of the trunk. If we were to trace a line from the base of the trunk and go straight up, perpendicular to the pot, is the top of the tree, the highest point, is it to the left or the right? It's to the left. That is one possible indicator of flow or movement. And so we can see in this case, the apex is left of that center line. But there's a couple of other indicators. This is one of the more basic ones. Bob, next. Another one is the primary branch. And so those are the first 2 that you pointed. Have any of you heard of the idea of a key branch before? Key? There's too many double entendres in bonsai. The idea of a key branch, there's a phrase in Japanese, sashi no eda, which is essentially the most prominent or direction indicating branch on the tree. Of all of the different branches, this one happens to be the lowest, the longest, and the heaviest. And the most prominent branch is another potential indicator of flow. And in this case, if we were to put an arrow on the end of this line, if we start at the trunk, it's growing outward. It's the direction in which it grows is indicating movement. We just don't see this movement because trees grow so slowly, we're not watching it. So the tree is moving, just imperceptibly slow, theoretically. Next. And there's yet another indicator of flow. The third one will be, and this is a little more subtle, it's the angle of the foliage on the canopy. Now, how many of you have ever thought of how to style the top of your tree before and wondered how to do it? How do you decide? And this is good for you, Renee. Like, how do you decide which branches are shorter, which are longer, what the angles are on the top? It makes you feel good. And that's how I do it too. And one way to learn bonsai, and it's kind of what I was getting at and asking Peter to mention that, where they didn't once explicitly talk about any of this stuff. If you stare at pictures or actual trees, hundreds, maybe thousands of them, you kind of internalize a sense of what's going on. And so I want to just kind of put our fingers on what the senses are. If we were to create a line out of the curved surface of the outer canopy, the angle's a little bit steeper on the left than on the right. And the relative steepness of those angles is actually a pretty considerable indicator of flow. So we're up to 3 of these so far. What's the next slide? Some people like visualizing it as straight lines. Some people like visualizing it as a curve. It's kind of like the direction of a wave. The steeper or shorter side indicates the flow of the direction. So this shape looks like it's flowing to the left. What's the next slide? The really obvious picture. And this is what we talk about when we talk about asymmetric triangles. If we were just to put in a darn hypotenuse at the bottom, got to have a few big words today. The shortest side of the triangle is going to be the directional side. The kind of second longest side is going to be the kind of away side. Next slide is going to be the opposite. If you can internalize these shapes and picture them on your trees, it'll give you a tool for helping you make decisions every single time you style a tree. Now, every single tree you look at, you can see, is it a little steeper on this side or a little steeper on this side? If you want to exaggerate flow in a certain direction, you can try maybe growing out one side or tightening up another side. And that is one of several things you can do. Now, do you have to do any of these three things on any given tree? Of course not. Do all three of these indicators we've talked about have to all go the same way? Definitely not. We're going to look at some examples of much more complex flow. Maybe the trunk grows one way, the longest branch goes the other, but then the head turns back the other. That's a common pattern. Kind of looks funny when we do it, but it can make sense on a lot of trees. And so we're going to take our cues from the trunks, but I wanted to start with these three core ideas and then look at a bunch of trees to see kind of what we can make of that. Because this tree flows to the left, we put our second tree in this case opposite that. So we have the ability of one tree to create a display that kind of points to the next tree, which can ideally point back towards the middle. Any questions so far? Do you think you could explain this to a new member if they walk in the next 20 minutes? We'll have more chances to practice. What's next? Okay, easy peasy. Does this tree flow left or right? Why? The apex is on the right. That's right. What's the next slide? Yeah, the apex is just barely to the right. You all said right just like that. You were actually noticing a very, very small difference of about 1.5 inches in that case. Why else? The trunk what? Oh, as in where it's in the pot, are you talking about? That's a very good point. That would be a fourth indicator of direction. There's a little more trunk on the left side of center than there is on the right side. In other words, if a tree points this way, we're going to scoot it to this side of the pot. And so that's a good subtle point. So we're now up to 4 ways to indicate flow to our viewers. Next slide. Did anyone notice at the top, much steeper side on the right, much shallower side on the left? What's the next one? And so as a result, for all those reasons, this tree would go on the left side of a display. It's kind of obvious which way that one points. Are a little more confident now about how this works? What's the next slide? All right, deciduous trees. Do the rules apply to deciduous trees as well? That was super confident. Yes? No? Why the hesitation? Do they apply to broadleaf evergreens? Succulents? I mean, they apply to pretty much everything, but we think of them a little bit differently. And deciduous trees, our indicators are typically much, much more subtle. And why would that be? Because the form deciduous trees take, because they grow in different environments, might take much more rounder, fuller forms, and that the indicators of flow might be much, much more subtle. All right. Which way does this one go? To the right. Why? Apex is off a little bit. Why else? Big branch on the bottom. Yes. Now, when you say big, is it because it's thicker or longer or lower? It's debatable which one of these two is longer. It might be that this branch is a tiny bit longer, but this branch is a little more prominent because it's lower and heavier. The key branch doesn't need to be the lowest or the longest. It just has to be a prominent branch, kind of serving in the function of the direction of the tree. All right, it's the next slide. What about this one? We going left or right? Well, so typically, we haven't talked about this yet. When we look at the trunk, the most important part of the trunk to pay attention to when determining its movement is the lower part of the trunk. Which way does the lower part of the trunk go? Decidedly right. But we kind of ignore that in this case because so much of everything else goes to the left. Next. And so in a display, it's kind of natural to have the one on the left and another one on the right, like that, where they can kind of point to each other. Now, I'm using the examples in displays right here, but the main reason we actually want to consider these concepts of flow are to help you style the trees you're working on. Often when a tree doesn't make sense or when you don't know what to do with it, if you start thinking about consciously how the different aspects of flow are contributing to the design, it might give you some concrete list to run through in terms of what you might be able to do to make your tree look more beautiful. you can start asking, do I want to shape the apex differently? Do I want to orient the tree in the pot differently? Do I want to grow a branch out or shorten a branch? All of these are options you have on all of your trees, and that can change over time. You don't have to get it all right the first time. What's next? Super easy, right? Which way does this one flow? One guess to the right? Let's try it this way. We'll take a vote. How many think it's flowing this way? Interesting, everyone on that side of the room. How many think it's flowing that way? That's it. I did not see that coming. Next slide. So, what factors are pointing to the left? What parts of the tree point left? Yes, by far the most prominent branch. We have a fantastic directional branch right here. Very, very prominent. So that is one vote for flowing to your left. Now, what's another indicator of flow? The trunk, say more. It's so funny. It's easy to answer questions with nouns. It's really hard to answer them with complete sentences. Yes, I was an English major several times over. Sorry. So say more about the trunk. It looks like it's pointing to the left. I should have brought a pointer. I can't reach that tall. So if you look at the base of the trunk is actually way over here. If we run a line straight up, the apex is to the left of the trunk. The other thing I'd say is that the lower part of the trunk, which in this design is quite prominent, very strongly runs to the left. So we've got, you could say 1 point for the lower trunk, 1 point for the key branch, and 1 point for the apex being left. If three obvious indicators all point left, why is it so ambiguous about whether or not it goes to the right? That's one of the reasons. If we look for the points on the other side, we've got 3 going left. To the right, we've got the slope is a little steeper on the right. We won't do wabi sabi tonight, so you're off the hook for that one. Um, balance is a noun. We need verbs to accompany those nouns. So one way to think of it is so you can talk about visual weight. If we were to slice the trunk off right at the base, which way is it going to fall? And it's clearly going to fall that way. That's another way to consider balance and flow in that case. But I think the other reason that we think it goes to the right is that from there up, the trunk is very strongly pointing that way. And when we looked at that little exposed root pine, the bottom went one way, but because so much went the other way, you ignored what the bottom of the trunk did and focused on the top. In this case, we're going to ignore the top of the trunk and focus more about what the lower trunk. Do you think this is an effective way to style this tree? If this was yours, would you make any obvious changes? I would say this is a good example of complex flow because we have 2 good indicators right, 3 good indicators left. Yeah. And by observation, do you mean left or right? And that's one thing that can often happen when you have complex flow. If everything's going one way, it's a very calming, it is simplistic in that you don't have to do a lot of work. It's not creating dissonance. When you've got flows in both directions, it makes you think a lot. And one reason is it can keep your eye within the frame because certain aspects are going to get you moving one way, other aspects are doing another. If your eyes are tracing the line of the trunk, you're going to start out this way. And when you get to this point, you have to make a decision. Are your eyes going to go left to the branch or right up to the top? There are some cases in which it makes sense to actually add complexity of design. And that is when you have either a simple tree that doesn't have a lot going on for it. Sometimes doing fun things with the balance can make it much more interesting by keeping your eyes in the gaze. And another opportunity for making more complex flow is when a tree just doesn't make any sense, when you just kind of don't get what's happening. I didn't address the negative space part of it because I don't know how it would inform flow in this case. And I just don't know one way or the other if negative space is affecting flow. Well, then it is. There we go. Yes. So if we were going to do it, yeah, I'll try to repeat the questions. To radically simplify the question is, does the complexity of the flow in the tree have anything to do with the fact that there's not a lot of flow in the accent plant? And I'd say there actually is some flow and it's kind of counterproductive. But if we were doing a talk just on accent plants, I would want there to be flow in every single accent plant or second tree. And so ideally, I would rather have these taller, longer reaching things on this side so it actually does point stronger in that direction. So I don't know that they consciously did that because of the flow of the tree. I would just get that this side probably looks a lot prettier than the other side, and that's why they use that side. And that if they had more time or put more energy into it, they might be able to maybe cut back some side, let other sides grow out, something like that. That'd be my guess. Yes. You could put, so the number of points doesn't actually determine which way it flows. In some cases, it's really ambiguous and it's just more of a feeling where that's going to go. So that's the first thing that comes to mind. And the other thing is, boy, I wish part of me is tempted to, and I promise I won't, so you're safe, but to do more of a treatise about what we're actually talking about when we're talking about negative space, because negative space is not a thing, it's the absence of a thing. And so talking about the absence of a thing requires at least one level of philosophical leap to figure out what we're talking about because it's only defined by things that actually do exist. And I took philosophy classes too. But meaning there is no negative space without positive space, and the positive space is doing all that work. So to talk about the negative space, we're either talking about the resulting shapes of where there have our liminal zones of positive space. See, I'm hopefully already lost the audience at home. Or um, you can talk about things like visual weight. And when you talk about visual weight, that's more like, again, if we cut it off, which way is it going to fall? Is there more foliage on one side, more foliage on another? I think if you put the accent on the other side, you would notice instantly why they would put it on this side. And I think that's why it's worth setting things up both ways and then just see what kind of feels best. Yeah. So people do that sometimes with medium displays, but the main what about it is what are your parameters for creating a display in the first point? In very conservative shows like the big famous ones in Japan, hyper conventionalized displays. Big trees, you get one big tree, one companion. Middle-sized trees, you get two middle-sized trees and a companion. Small trees, you get a bunch of small trees and a companion. But it's the same basic shtick. We don't follow those conventions that much to the letter over here. And so we can actually create displays that have any number of display elements in them. And if you think that's the most compelling story that you can tell, then you just kind of go for it. For the Pacific Bonsai Expo, we don't actually enforce rules about this stuff. We just let people kind of do what they want, and then we let the world decide if they like it or not. Dancing comes up a lot as a metaphor for bonsai. Oh, I'd need a massage to get into that position. Yeah, I don't know. What's the next slide we got? Exactly. So I mentioned it's a little more subtle with deciduous trees. What are our direction? What do we have going on flow wise for this guy right here? Right. Because Yeah, the apex. Yeah, the highest point of the tree is just to the right of center. A little bit steeper angle on the right side. Yep. And then what about the boy, it's pretty much planted in the center, isn't it? We're not getting it's maybe a tiny bit left, but maybe a centimeter, not it's pretty much centered in the pot there. What about the trunks? Are the trunks going any one way more than another? Yeah, the primary trunk's doing a lot. What's the next slide? It's interesting. You've got probably an equal number of trunk inches going left or right, but we really do key a lot off the longest or largest trunk, which is decidedly kind of going to the right. Interestingly, there are more heavy branches kind of pointing to the left on the top of this tree. And so those are the kind of things you can think about when you're pruning is, do you like that it's kind of coming back towards the center, which gives it that more informal upright feeling where it's a very balanced and centered composition? Or do you want to kind of play up that it starts right and goes left? But it'd be really easy to prune some of those heavier things left and it would feel a lot stronger flow. Um, a flow is a really subtle thing for deciduous. What do you think, Peter? Do you need more flow or less flow, or would you just kind of leave it like that? It just fell in your lap. It's your tree right now. Do you have a knee-jerk reaction, or is it like within spitting distance? And so, for those that didn't hear that, what Peter's saying is he might try to prune the branches in a way that could kind of clarify the flow that key from the trunk. And I'd say that touches on one of my tip-top favorite topics, and this is going to be a big clue for the second half of the program. A lot of your design decisions are going to stem from how you interpret what the main trunks are doing in this case, or the V trunk when there's just one trunk. Making decisions in light of the best points of the trunk or what you want to kind of show people or share with people about the trunk is going to be your big decider. And I think that would kind of be my gut reaction as well. What's next? Yeah, there it goes off to the right. But I keep noticing that one really heavy branch kind of pointing to the left up at the top. It's really funny. Just based on what little we've done so far, does any of this seem helpful? Have you heard any of this before, or is this making it more complicated or less complicated so far? Oh, it's fair if you say it makes it worse. I find more and more that when I'm working on a tree, I'll maybe do the work, I'm getting close to it, and then I'll back away from it, get down at eye level. Whenever you're looking at a tree, always aim for, same thing with holding a camera. Find a spot 1/3 of the way from the top of the pot to the top of the tree. So you get your eyes to about this level, and then you look from that level, and I'll get quite a ways away. For a tree this big, I'd probably be about 12, 15 feet away. And then you just start seeing, well, what if I played up the flow that way? What if I played it up the other way? And whether it's a conifer or deciduous, there's always something you can do to kind of refine that. Which one's next? Another obvious one, right? Which way is this going, left or right? Because apex of the main trunk points left. What else? Yeah, two of the three are going left. The main trunk's going left. The root mass is a little bit to the right side. This is actually common too, where it's a little bit higher on that side, a little bit lower on this side. That also kind of creates flow to the left. But when you're not getting as much of a clue from the foliage, because we're just getting these small puffs, the foliage, we don't have really obvious key branches kind of doing work because it's been designed so consistently. We have a couple long branches on the right, we have a couple long branches on the left. And so it's really the kind of left two trunk, center and left trunk that give us our main flow off to the left. Yes, and so that's another way to think of it is where does the foliage is only just outside there, but on this side, the foliage is way outside of that. And that's another really good indicator of our leftward movement on this one. How many of you like the way that looks from a flow perspective, or how many wish it was kind of clarified a little bit? So you say clarify. What would be the first one or two things that come to mind that you might do to enhance the flow? And when you lengthen these branches, are you lengthening the upper ones, the middle ones, the lower ones, all of them? Yeah, I think lengthening the branches on the left and especially at a low angle would be one of the absolute most obvious things to do. What's another thing you might do to enhance on that leftward flow? Oh, and have the right tree point that way too? And that could be done as easily by either a little bit of a bend or just growing it a little bit longer so it comes over that way. And then it has a little more wind influenced feel to it. When trunks that start out one way finish that way, it would it just makes it look like a different kind of mountain scene that way. I think that's right. What else? Yeah. That would be another way to do it. Thinning the branches on the right would be yet another way to kind of lighten up that side from a visual weight perspective. One of the things, your first comment about growing the branches longer, one of the most obvious things you can do to indicate flow in a given direction is when you have branches that are the same on both sides to improve the flow, if you shorten branches on one side and lengthen them on the flow side, that's one of the very easiest things you can do. When things are perfectly symmetrical, whether the shape of the canopy or the length of the branches, you leave the viewer often at a loss. And those are some of the very first things you want to do. So that was a good one to mention. Yeah. Uh-huh. It's interesting what effect that would have on the flow. I think from a perspective of visual weight, that's where you might notice it have an effect on flow. I'd say branches that come forward and especially branches that go backwards are our number one friends when we're trying to create depth in a composition. And then the question is, what does that depth cost or afford us in terms of enhancing or detracting from, the given flow in a certain way? Yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah, modifying the pot's one of the more common things you can do. This is kind of a non-bond style, kind of a contemporary non-bond style, or non-bond means Southern barbarian. Interesting side note. Um, Literally it means, yeah, non is Southern, Southern barbarian. But yeah, if you have the pot up a little bit higher on the outside and lower, maybe a more contemporary pot would also enhance that kind of motion. Yeah. Shortening it could also do that. I would say shortening it would be a really good idea just because it's so similar in height to the second tree. And whenever you have things that are the same, it kind of levels and flattens it out, which kind of destroys the flow. Making it taller with a big angle or shortening it, either of those could really emphasize the movement left. And that's the way trees grow, is if there's light in all directions, you expect there to be branches in both directions. We just get to decide if we want to play that up or kind of play that down. Yeah. Deadwood's very interesting to consider a flow, especially for conifers. And I think, actually, I don't know that we'll have a whole lot of those today. I see a lot of broadleaves today. But yes, interestingly, it's not uncommon to have deadwood going in any which direction, and we key more from the living parts of the tree than the dead. But deadwood can have a huge effect on our feeling of flow. And sometimes I'll want to shorten a gin or maybe leave a gin longer when I'm creating it to exaggerate a flow in one direction or to minimize flow in direction. So yeah, I think that's a very important consideration. What's next? Another clear case. Which way is this tree flowing? Because, yep, yep. And so when we have large trunk trees, they tend to have heavier branches, and we tend to see a lot more indicators of flow that all kind of go the same direction. And so in this case, the shape of the apex, the location of the apex, the line of the trunk, and the key branch, all of those things all go that way. I think there's still a ton of things to do design wise to make improvements to this tree. Um, right now, I'd say one of the first things that comes to mind is this tree comprises 5 blocks. We pretty much have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and all 5 of them are more or less the same size and more or less the same shape. And that makes for very static because we've got these stacked blocks on top of each other. Offsetting them can give you a lot more feeling of movement. And so there are tons of things you can do just in the arrangement of it. I'm not going to hold that, that won't be on the test because there's kind of a lot more to that one. But in terms of our general bonsai design, I would say that in general, the wider the trunk, the wider you can expect the branches to be. The skinnier the trunk, the shorter you can expect the branches to be. Here's an example you probably won't forget. Coast redwood, tallest tree in the world. What would it look like if the branches were 400 feet wide? It would look like it's about to fall over. If you look at the silhouette of a big redwood, it would be very tall and very skinny branches. So that's one thing you're kind of always keeping in your mind is this foliar outline appropriate for the weight of the trunk? And that's going to be the case for all of the trees. So I'm introducing these other design ideas because it's also going to help on the quiz. What's next? Yep. Yeah, there we are. And you can see the higher part, the heavier part of the containers on the outside kind of pointing down. I don't know that they've, yeah, actually there's a little bit, these arcs are a little bit higher than those. They probably plucked the ones that were going more left on that. They also positioned it where there's just a little bit of slab to the left and a little more on the right. So you actually can do things with direction on the accent like that. All right, next one. Interestingly, the same artist that created the 3-trunked composition we were just looking at a couple slides ago. Are we going left or right? And so we've got the apex, we've got the key branch. Interestingly, if we were to cut this one off at the base, would it fall to the left or the right? It might just fall forward or backwards. It's hard to tell. Because we have such a strong movement at the base where the trunk is the heaviest, we're not back at the center line until way up here. And so we have all of this weight of the trunk plus some of the branches where we have all this lighter weight material off to the left. Visually, there's by far more to the left. Now, here's an example where there's almost no negative space at all. And so I would say in this case, it might be worth thinking based on the width of the canopy, as we compare that to the thickness of the trunk, do we have too much foliage, not enough foliage, or the right amount of foliage? Too much? Anyone think it's just right? Other than the owner? Okay, we have a couple people who agree with the owner, who's a very talented, experienced artist. Anyone think we don't have enough foliage? This, by the way, is a Western hemlock, and it's one of the only Western hemlock bonsai we know of. Most bonsai hemlock that we see are all mountain hemlock. This is one of the rare Western hemlocks from up north. I would say if it's off perfect, it's on a little more foliage than I'd want to see for the heaviness of the trunk. But on the other hand, that gives it a very gentle feeling. Also notice that the artist, instead of making these tight pads, which are a very formal look for a hemlock, he purposefully gave it a very relaxed feeling, and he let the tree grow out after the last time he wired it. And he did this very consciously because he wanted to look like a soft weeping tree, which is how they look in nature. Yeah. You know, I would love to actually measure that. I've also heard that a lot of people will suggest that the Western world loves trees that flow from left to right because that's how we write and approach text. And that the Eastern world, it goes, I just ignore that until it's measurably, demonstrably the case. I just don't know. But I do know that many people, if you go home and look at your trees, you might find that 3/4 of your trees all flow one way, not the other. Like I know that my trees, more than the average person's trees, flow this way because I see a lot of collections where everything goes that way. But I would love to see it measured. I don't like repeating the things until someone looks that up, and I've not taken the time to measure that one. What's next? What about this one? We going left or right? It's interesting. I'd say from here down, everything is really extremely obvious right. But from here up, it's almost a fair fight. So zoom out, next slide. And yeah, overall by far, you really notice that even in these ones that curve over, these trunks that curve over, that overall by far the movement is going to the right and makes a really nice companion to the big tree on the left. And also, as we keep pointing out, notice how the ground level is higher on the outside, a little lower on the inside. There's these subtle things that people do that I think we notice a lot. Next. All right, the tough one. What kind of tree is this? Ginkgo. What do they call this style? Flame style. It's such a negative. You'd think trees would have a chip on their shoulder about flames since we typically burn wood, but which way is it flowing? Left or right? Where's the accent go? Well, so do I put the accent right here? The accent's either going over here or over there. Many of you in this room saw this tree displayed, so there's some imprint somewhere in your brain. A lot of you have actually seen this tree. So your vote's for the right side? And what are you seeing in the tree that's telling you that? Heaviness of branches. What's going to left, Vince? The apex is slightly left. Okay, let's take a vote. How many say it's going to the right? Oh, whew, we're balancing. How many say it's going to the left? All right, that's pretty darn split. Let's look at some of the visual cues. Are we sure the apex is going left? The apex is pretty much centered. I'd say there's a few more taller branches on the left than on the right. What about, but it's pretty darn centered. I'd also say your very first comment about more overall branches on the right is also true. But zoom in, next one. Well, the tree is planted oh so subtly with a little bit over to the right, which would suggest flow in this direction. It's also a little higher on that outside. It's very close. Yeah, you're right. There is more mass over there, but the tree is cheated, especially it's really clear up there. There's kind of a lot of tree over to the right and not much over to the left. So, final picture. How many of you would want to make a few tweaks to suggest more flow on this tree? Y'all think it's pretty good the way it is? Yeah, I think the first change that I would make it, I would use a pot with much softer features instead of the blocky straight line pot. That's kind of the first thing that comes to my mind. I also use a much bigger stand, but it's hard to find good stands like that. That is an antique Chinese container, so it's a really nice pot. How many of you have worked with ginkgo before? How many of you know how nightmarishly challenging it is to make them that dense? If you haven't worked with ginkgo, this is a freakish level of density. I mean, you just don't see a lot of ginkgo that are much more dense than that. It's a very, very well executed thing. Don't know if we have a lot of directionality in the accent plant, but I will say there's a few tall things kind of pointing back. Which one's next? All right, left or right? What's your overall gut feeling? Okay, we'll vote again. How many say left? How many say right? And those who say the right, what are your feelings about why it would go to the right? I I don't know that I made out any of that. Why is it going to the right? What are our right indicators? I'd say the apex is pointing right. If you start right about there, the trunk goes pretty strongly. So the trunk finishes pretty strongly to the right. The angles on both sides are almost identical. It's kind of not giving you any cues at all. Might be a tiny bit steeper on that side, but it's subtle. But we've got some trunk movement to the right, but the lowest movement is left. The biggest movement to the trunk is left. The longest branches are pretty strongly left. And from the center of the pot, yeah, it's pretty darn centered. Pretty informal upright. Next slide. And so I think this is an example of a tree where when the movement of the trunk is just kind of weird, to put it mildly, you can kind of play with some back and forth stuff, or maybe the top goes one way and a branch goes the other way. And I think this is actually a really graceful solution to the challenge of what do you do with a trunk that starts perfectly straight and then just has a big hook in the middle, which is not an uncommon challenge. Can you think of any other things you could do to the tree to kind of enhance how it's displayed, or do you think you kind of did a good job with it? Yeah, if you didn't catch that, what Kathleen's talking about, she wishes she could see the rest of the tree. What is really striking about this tree in person is this part of the trunk comes way forward, right towards you, and it actually looks more normal in 2 dimensions than it does in three. And this front branch actually comes way from the back and then curves towards us, and it's coming towards us, so it has really fantastic depth. But next time I'll just bring a 3D version of it, and we'll turn it around and try to do that. If you haven't seen it, the 3D scans from last year's Pacific Bonsai Expo are absolutely fantastic. I highly recommend going through that. There's some free ones available on the website, some samples you can check out. And if you'd like, I think it's about $20 for 3 years of access to the scans. They're absolutely fascinating and a good way to answer the question, what does it look like from the back, or from above, or from below? What's next? All right, another obvious one. Which way does it go, left or right? All right, so if we start at the base of the trunk, where's the apex? Tiny bit to the right. But what about the angles of the top? Are the angles on the top giving you any suggestion at all of flow? They're almost precisely even. But we've got a really obvious branch, and the branch is the most interesting feature on the tree, other than the deadwood. We've got like this awesome strip of interest right here in the middle, and then we've got the lifeline that goes up, comes down, just doesn't like what it sees, changes its mind, then goes back out again. And so that's what gives us the most prominent feature to the side. Next. It's really hard to see if there's any difference between those two. You might even be able to make a case that's a little steeper off to the left, but it's almost precisely the same on both sides. But what's not the same is that branch. And that's, if we didn't have that branch, would you say the tree goes left or right? Let's just say that that the lifeline just like lost the battle and this was nothing but a tiny gin right here. Would the tree still flow right, or would it flow left at that point? Or would you want to change the planting angle a little bit? Because without that branch, we'd have this awesome feature right here and a prominent low branch down here. But we also still have this massive movement in the low part of the trunk. And so I'd say because of this great movement at the lower part of the trunk, the most obvious front is going to be, or the most obvious flow will be looking for ways of enhancing or kind of keying off of that part of the trunk and keeping our emphasis over there. And so one benefit of keeping the top without stating a strong opinion about the flow is that it can call more attention to things like the feature branches, which is what's going on here. And so this is one of the first cases we've seen where not making a decision or not stating an opinion is actually another form of decision, which can call or focus our attention to a certain part of the tree. And there we are with our accent off to the side. Very quiet, second piece, very quiet accent plant. Very quiet tree, crazy excitement right in the middle. Broadleaf evergreens are often very similar to deciduous trees in that you don't get such dramatic twists and turns in the trunk. You don't get such dramatic pointy or angular shapes. You often get these big rounded features because you expect them to grow in less harsh environments and therefore take on fuller, rounder features. And the artist of this tree really plays that up and just gives us very soft, very full compositions. I was actually just in his backyard a few days ago, and pretty much every one of his trees has this really full, really soft feeling. And his deciduous trees, I don't know that any of them have a single piece of difference. They're all just these, they have a tiny point on the top and they're just perfectly symmetrical side to side. But the trunk in every one of his cases will give you a tip about the direction. So which way are we going with this one? Yeah, it goes pretty strongly to the left. The lower trunk, the upper trunk. This is a good example of what we talked about, which was your point, that to exaggerate flow to the left, these branches were let to grow longer and the branches on the right side were all kept shorter. This is a very good example of that. Yeah, it's Mike Roberts' tree. And boy, does he have an exciting tree lined up for the next expo. I was very excited to see. All right, next. Yeah, so there we are with an accent, again, with more container a little higher up on the outside to kind of point us back towards the center. He also gave us an accent plant, AKA weed, on the side. He actually feels really strongly about creating scale in his works, and so he very frequently will give us a little accent or a little something. There's a little hidden treasure in there somewhere. Funny to call Poa annua a treasure, the but it's really important to him to create scale, and these things feel more massive in his mind, which is why he gives us the accents there. All right, next. All right, another Sierra juniper. This is another artist that often doesn't give us a lot of cues from the top of the tree. Which way does the trunk go? Which way does the key branch go? This gets into the definition of a key branch. Is it the lowest branch, which is super skinny, or is it this giant, long, prominent branch over on the left? Because we see the lower trunk flowing right, we think of this as the more key or directional branch. Now, what about the shape of the apex? When we talked about the shape of that crown with those wave-like images we saw, just the shape of the crown, are we going more left or right? Like if we just covered up the lower part of the tree, I'd argue that the top's going to the left. Yeah, very slightly, I agree. Because this section right along there is really flat and it comes down a little steeper over here. But now we can get to your point about the deadwood. Deadwood is giving us a really prominent directional cue right here. So let's see if any of us are right. Yeah. And the stag decided that it's a really impressive tree. That must be a big Sierra juniper if the deer's looking up at it. Do you think that's the right call for putting the accent over on that side? Yeah, I'd do the same thing. What's next? Yes. Uh-huh. Yep. And that's why a key branch isn't necessarily the longest, heaviest, or lowest branch, because we often need these counterbalance branches to make them not look tippy. And so that's a really good point about how that's working. It also makes you wonder if that branch were to come down lower and fit in down lower, if that would give you more of a complex flow going in both directions, or if it would help you clarify. That's something fun to think about. And if you're good at Photoshop, you just mock it up and take a peek. All right, another obvious one, right? What makes us think it might be going to the right? The lowest foliage, the lower part of the trunk, and maybe even the steeper angle on the top. What makes us think it might be going to the left? Yeah, the top part of the apex kind of goes to the left. We have a good prominent drop branch right here. Did you guys ever discuss changing the flow or putting the accent on different sides on this? Or was there a discussion around it? Yeah. And was everyone comfortable with it being back and forth? Or was it weird that it could go one way or could go the other way? Oh, just like how you pot the thing? Yeah, and that's sometimes the most obvious thing to do. And so This to me is one of the first trees that makes me think of that concept of balance, because balance is one of the biggest things we have to work with. Um, because it's an unusual design. It doesn't fit our idealized cognitive model. Oops, two big words now. But when we close our eyes and think tree or bonsai, that's typically not what shows up. But it's a really elegant design and it's really well executed. But it just gives us that question about where to go with it. How many of you want the accent plant to be over on the right? Everyone wants it over on the left? Not as many votes. It must be almost break time. Let's see where it landed. Accent's over here. And I think Peter's point about whether or not the tree was just leaned a tiny bit to one side is a fantastic way to kind of get off the fence and pick a direction for the lean. I think that makes all kinds of sense. The thing that I think personally came to mind when I thought of this tree and which way I would do the balance is, it's like I can imagine the shade from this branch, and that feels like kind of an inside area. When you have a big curve like this, we talk about, a pigeon-breasted trunk that comes towards you, you'd rather be looking at the inside of a curve. Insides of curves feel like an inside or interior space. Likewise, the inside of this big curve, to me, feels like an interior space, and it's an interior space with a little bit of shade. So I actually really like that the flow is going to the left in this direction for all of those reasons. And I think this lower foliage provides great counterbalance. And I think we have, remember the stacked foliage on the black pine? Look at how kind of we have one and then two and then three and then four. We've got more staggered foliage up on the top. And I think that staggering just gives it such a dynamic feel. It's really pretty. All right. Are we going left or right? Because trunk, the apex, the max, key branch. What's the next slide? This is actually a really common pattern where the base of the trunk will go in one direction, and there'll be, because it has such a lean or slant to it, you'll often see the apex go another direction and or a key branch going in another direction because of balance. And so totally acceptable to do it this way, because it might look funny if the tree's leaning and all the foliage is hanging out. All of a sudden you have a really strong wind influence design when that happens. Next one. And so in this case, the overriding movement of the trunk is the primary determination of the flow. The stand also makes a subtle suggestion. The stand's trying hard, the wire's holding it down. Stand's trying to levitate over to the side here. Very magic carpet feel to it. Does the deadwood feel like it's pulling your eyes left at all, or is the foliage so overwhelmingly to the right that that's meaningless that it's pointing left? Yeah, yeah, yeah. Ah, yeah. Could you back up to that? I guess one more, two more. There we go. Ah, it's also very quiet, just that it's a round stone. Whereas if this had a little bit of life to it, it might speak to and point a little bit more. That this stone doesn't have, it doesn't offer a strong opinion about which way it's going. Yeah. Yeah, this curve right here on the right side of the stone would fit right into the pocket of that. Of course, the apex of the stone's a little left, but you're right, it's not doing as much directional work. It's just a very quiet piece. It's almost meant to say, yeah, I'm over here, but really just focus over here. It's an interesting way to go for that. And now back to where we were on the next. And I think this is a case where even though we've got a prominent gin and a prominent deadwood, you just don't consider it, because there's so many other strong indicators of flow kind of off to the other side. The stand is making a strong opinion about which way it's flowing. And so we've got just lots of indicators from every design element on there. All right, what's next? Yes, it's a companion. Why don't you guys come back one? A companion to the companion. So yeah, we have a little, that's, I'm blanking on the name there, but a, what? No, the name of the plant. Saxifrage. It's saxifrage. What do you want me to say about it? It's possible that the person that made this display, I think he might have actually made the tree, made the pot, made the stand, made the tree. I know he made that stand. I don't think he made the slab, but he made most of the design elements or display elements in this. And so this is Eric Schrader's display. And yeah, that's used bonsai wire, probably number 8 copper. Yeah. I would say it is a major design convention to have semi-cascade junipers, whichever way they're always going to be pointing out and or down off to the side. And so if you follow the line of the trunk, it's going down. And I probably would have thought to put, maybe an accent a little further out, but he probably just didn't have a big enough slab for underneath that. But in general, yes, it's totally fine for it to be pointing down, but I might have wanted the accent out a little bit, which means I might have thought twice about what I had down below. This stands a little bit heavy for balancing all of that. So there's actually several things going on. I'd say even worse to the flow than this, which I find acceptable, because at least it's getting your eyes going that direction. But this pulls you straight down here. And that I want that a little more to the right. Yeah. Oh, situate the plant even more to the left? Oh, oh, so if you just brought it a tiny bit more over. I don't know that there's a guiding rule for that. The way I think about it is when you have prominent lines you're working with to take them into consideration, because there's so many different ways in which they can puzzle together, and ultimately you kind of go with what feels right and what you have on hand. You call your friends and see who can borrow a stand from or who you can borrow a slab or accent from, and then you put together the best you can. But I would say it's something you consider. I don't know that we can create a rule from that. That'd be my guess. All right, broadleaf evergreen, much more gentle, full feeling. Is the trunk stating opinion about the flow? Yes? Which way is the trunk going? And how is the trunk going to the right? You mean the part that's pointing strongly to the left, or the part that's going, or just the fact that this, because this is really all we can see of the trunk above here. So I guess I could say another way, from here down, is the trunk giving us much flow? And then from here up, is it giving us much flow? Yeah, I'd say at best it's debatable. What about the branches? Are there some obvious prominent branches that are pointing left or right? Because there's a little bubble right there, but I'd say that might actually be longer than what we have over here, but they're almost identical. Yeah, this branch, one thing about this branch is the distance from the trunk out is short, but it's actually much bigger because this pad actually starts all the way over here. So if we take this whole flying saucer as a single branch, that's way bigger than the foliage block over on the left side. And so that's something that's really hard to see in the photo, but it's really clear when you're looking at the tree in person, is it has the appearance of being more forward, a little bit lower, and much larger. And so that's probably a bad example to show that. You could also say that because you're seeing this little shoulder right here, even though you can't really see anything above that, with the exception of the window above, is this actually is a pretty strong indicator that something's going to the right, as is that whole right-hand segment to it. So it's the same basic features. It just takes a different form when the trunk takes a different form. What about the shape of the crown? Is that doing much work one way or the other? The angle's a little steeper on the right, but there's a steeper drop on the left there. It's interesting. And so, do we have a next slide on that one? Which, well, right. And so that's the way it normally goes, is if it leans right, we usually offset it left. We can see one of our strongest indicators is that the top of the tree is actually to the right of the base of the trunk, but not by a whole lot. And so let's look at it with the display. Oh, we talked about the lowness of the branches, which I already pointed out, that we're a little bit lower on the one on the right, but not a huge difference since both of them kind of turn up a little bit. And there we go with the accent off to the right. And so it's fine for there to be really subtle movement. It's just, I'm hoping the next time your show's coming up very, very soon. It's almost April o'clock. And a lot of you are going to be setting up your displays, and you've got about the perfect amount of time to make last minute adjustments to your trees, whether it's, pruning cuts or some wire adjustments, to start thinking through what you can do to play up or play down some aspects of flow on your displays. All right. Which way does this one go? Left. And I'll ask the question differently. This is another really unfair tree to evaluate in 2 dimensions rather than 3. What is the single most obvious thing that stands out to you about the indication of flow? The branch. The branch is just so prominent because it's large and low. And but you'll notice that what lines there are in the trunk kind of go left, the shape of the top goes to the left. The cleaner your apical outline is, the more we're going to pay attention to it. When it's soft and fuzzy, you can kind of get away with a little less, or a little more. But when it's very closely cropped and you achieve those great levels of density, we all become much more critical of being able to analyze, is it going this way, is it that way, is the top here or there? And in this case, it was very consciously created. I don't think that was arbitrary to suggest a little bit of movement left in the trunk, a little bit of left in the crown, and then really reinforced with that lower branch. Anything else we missed on that, Peter? But I would guess that you probably didn't talk or even think consciously about left or right the entire process of making that tree, because you just work with what's there. It's like you've got the trunk, so you need some foliage out there, and you've got the branch, and it's, in other words, you probably weren't, I would guess you weren't super conscious about doing anything other than what looked right. Does that sound fair? Yeah, and so it, you sounds like hadn't done a lot of this kind of thinking up till now, and you don't necessarily need to going forward, but it's just the kind of thing you can play with. All right. Yeah, and there we are. You can see the longest branches on the button fern are kind of sticking out to the right. Next. Okay, we'll have to zip through these. Any strong ideas about whether this is going left or right? Let's just take a vote. How many think it's going to the left? How many think it's going to the right? How many of you haven't seen the tree in person? Yeah, most of you saw it in person. Yeah. Next. This one you all found obvious. And what was obvious about that one pointing to the right? Speak. The branch, slightly more prominent right there. Tiny bit lower, maybe a tiny bit longer. Actually, a little steeper angle on the left side. But somehow, because such super precise, clean, and wonderfully arranged foliar work led everyone to think immediately to the right. And one thing is, I mean, if you measured it, your brains were probably doing some micro measurements, but you don't notice, but a tiny bit lower on the one side. But I will say a lot more foliar blocks on the right, where we have a little more gap space, a little more seeing the trunk, little branch, little branch. Here we have a big one, medium one, small, small. Overall, there's more stuff going on, and I think that visual weight's one of the strongest things keying over. I'd never thought of it before that till looking at it just now, but people don't really get the flow wrong on that, and that's my guess why. Man, if you squint, it's almost, oh man, that's really subtle. That's very, very subtle. I don't know that I'd argue that goes one way or the other. But that is a consideration. Sometimes there can be really prominent roots or much longer roots on one side, which can differ. Kind of like Jeremiah's that Sierra juniper that really swooped off to the right. Same kind of thing. This root is decidedly kind of pointing off to the side. All right. Deadwood is definitely not stating an opinion. We're a perfectly formal upright design, but there is a little movement left at the base of the trunk. And that probably is what led the artist to kind of lean into that by placing the apex over on the left. And because the apex is on the left, we then have a much longer branch, a more prominent key branch on that left side. And so when we look at the whole display, we have a tree that naturally grows under redwood. So that would be a really big fern scale-wise next to that red. Japanese maple, Shishigashira, or lion's head maple. Guys, he's been working on it 45 or 55 years now, I forget. I think it started around 1971 or something, so it's about my age. Next. I'd say the base of the trunk's going right, the lowest branch is really strong, and then the apex goes over. But interesting how balanced it feels because of how long the branches are on the left and how round the apex is, that the loudest answers I heard were all going right, but again, pretty subtle. Here's one. This will be a good one to finish with. Left or right? And now for bonus points, what kind of tree is this? Nope, not a Zelkova. Do you remember, Travis? Washington Hawthorne. Yes, Washington Thorn. This was by Dennis Wojtyła, who started out in Oakland. He's now up outside of Portland, Oregon. Super beautiful tree. Now Tokatake pot. Giant opinion has been made about where to plant it that is really strongly suggesting movement to the left. Much, much longer branches on the left side of the tree than on the right. And the main trunk line definitely goes left. So for as perfectly round as the silhouette is, we have some really, really strong indicators of flow to that left side. I'd say you get to decide if you want to play that up by moving it over in the pot. And so I have seen a lot of trees where it's either complicated or maybe not totally sorted out balance wise, and you just solve that by moving the tree over a little bit. And so that can be kind of an end run around the problem, just to kind of show the line of the trunk a little differently. Okay, now the whole display. Yeah, really pretty display. Kind of wish the fruit were over on that side, but you know, whatever. Beautiful Gaultheria, it looks like. Really pretty. And is that the end of it? I think that really was. Oh gosh. We might just need to get to your trees. This one's really obvious, but it's a good case. It kind of shows the deadwood off to the side. We really clue into the foliage more than the deadwood. Next. As expected. Next. Oh, that's it. Okay, good. We were one off. All right. What is your schedule like? 7:30. Is it? Well, we could we could do another 10 minutes and start going through the trees we have up here. Let's do that. We already covered the Hinoki well. What about our boxwood? Will the accent plant be going to the left or to the right? Because you all pretty much lead the discussion on this one. Why is this one going to the left? The lowest, most prominent branch is left. Does anyone, including the owner, have a different opinion? Had you thought about the shape of the apex in terms of flow before? And so, how do you read the shape of the crown in light of what we just talked about? Do you think you're getting much of a clue on the top? But it's a broadleaf evergreen, so it might be fine. It's just slightly to the left in the pot. I'd say the surface roots are more or less centered, but the main trunk line is actually to the right of center, which I think is really nice. So I think this is a good example of, it just gives it a quieter feeling because it's such subtle indicators that way. But it's clean because they're not really fighting against each other. Let's jump over to the maple. Which way is the maple flowing? And because? Yeah, the trunk's leaning right. What's the apex doing in the shape of the crown doing? Yeah, the apex is going a little bit to the left, and the very top is, but so I'd say even though the shape of the trunk is kind of coming to the left, if you look at the highest point, it's almost precisely over, if not a little bit to the right of center. I think the branch by far is the most important key in that case, and we kind of let go of all the rest. It's also a really good example that in general, all the branches on the left are a little shorter and the branches on the right are a little longer. And that's just one of our obvious kind of gut ways of telling which way it goes. Let's go through the other guys here. Now, is the redwood intended to go with the maple or is that separate? Separate. All right. Which way is the redwood going? We have one design element to key from right here. It's kind of really obviously going to the right. So the question is, and this is such a great example, when you have a young tree in development and you've established the flow based on the trunk, you have a lot of decisions you can make on the foliar design now. There kind of are no key branches yet. Should there be a key branch? You get to decide. Where do you want to actually put the apex? Do you want to kill off the top and keep the apex low? Do you want to let it grow in? Now's a good time to start thinking about where to go with it. Even if it's not time to make those decisions in the design, it is the time to start thinking about how to do that. And that can be done by the angle of a low branch, whether or not there's a gap between a low branch and what comes up after it. You can see the angle's a lot softer on the left, a lot steeper on the right. So all of our cues are there, and we have no more than about 1.75 inches of branches all the way around the thing. And yet still we have really good flow. So that's going to, you essentially know how you're going to be displaying that years before it's going to be anywhere near a display, which is kind of nice. Now, is there even an answer to this question? And thanks for whoever brought it. It's gorgeous. Ian, is it going one way or the other? You're looking right at it. I, c- I, I can't tell from here. This might be one of those cases where you pull a Peter and you just lean the tree over to make sure it flows one way. But yeah, the branches do seem much more prominent on that right side. Who's the owner of the tree? How do you think of the flow? To the right, yeah. Unless the show's now a clock, it's hard to show that one, yeah. Show a picture of it at the show. Yeah, it's like my wisteria. I don't know when it's going to show because unless there's a show that day, it just no one cares. Yeah. Oh, this one will be a fun one to look at. Let's look at the maple here. What kind of maple is that? Snake bark. That's what that says. All right. Are we flowing left or right on this one? So I've seen there's a design thing we didn't talk about often in forest plantings where, assuming these are all different trees, it kind of works the same for clump styles, but often the tallest tree will be on the outside rather than the inside, meaning the accent would go over on the right. But that's not always the case. And so I'd say if you're curious about how you want to do that, this is when flipping through show books is really valuable to see when the highest part of the composition is on the outside, see when the highest part's on the inside, decide which you like, and then maybe you can decide to tilt the whole thing one way to really clarify which way you want it to go, leave it totally flat and let people question it, or maybe see if it looks better or even worse, because if you tilt it to the left, what you do is you start raising these other guys and it doesn't look as good. And so That's my first guess is that you'd be kind of putting it to the outside there. And whether you leave it like that or tilt it at the tiniest bit to the right, that would be my first guess. But I will say that I've seen people do it both ways in that case. But like really, really good example of that. And it's going to be great. How does it ramify for you? It looks like it's coming along pretty well. Yeah. No, it looks great. Speaking of, here actually is a 3 tree clump style. I won't even have an opinion about this one. Does this have flow one way or the other? I love it. You can't see, but people are nodding yes and no at the same time. Whose tree is this one? Do you have an opinion about which way it's going to flow? So when you get it out of a round pot and put it in an oval and tuck it over to the side, you can convey that really easily. Round pot makes it really, it makes it harder to tell which way it's going like this. So you may not even need to twist or rotate it, even if you left it exactly the same. Just putting it in an oval and cheating it over a tiny bit over to the right could take care of that easy if you want to play up that kind of movement in that direction. Over time, you could also control the shape of this trunk. Right now, that's really round on your main trunks in the back. And by kind of changing the shape one way or the other, you might be able to decide if you want to play that movement up or play it down. And I'd say the weight would really depend on precisely where the front is, because I can't tell because it's in a round pot right now. And I'm not looking at the front. But a tiny rotation actually changes that calculus where it could be going left or right towards you. Yeah, because these trunks are actually a little heavier than those. And those are heavier than those. Yeah, I mean, from where I am, the heavier trunks are actually on the right side, but more of the trunks are on the left. And so you've got weight versus numbers of trunks. Exactly. So when we jump over to the trident here, whose is this? Does this one have a direction yet? Have you come to that yet? This isn't that it's in that teenage stage right now. I think over time you can make a case in either direction. It really depends on where you go with the branches at this point. Because the top of the apex goes to the right and your lowest branch point is to the right, it'd be really easy to play that up. But by the same token, if you keep the right side short and really grow this out right here, it'd be really easy to kind of grow it into the left as well. So it's this early in development, you're already starting to think about that. So whether you're keeping the full silhouettes like the redwood and the maple, or you're just kind of growing the whole thing out, it's not too early to start thinking about where you're going with it. Well, that could be a really good Shohin companion piece for kind of off to the side because it's got that really strong semi-cascade movement. So that's coming along great. Oh, another easy one. Good. So the potting decision alone makes this really easy. The lowest, most prominent branch is very definitely to the right, but by planting the whole tree to the left, it's just screaming at us that we want to move it over. Now we have the ability to change that over time, but the planting angle alone really plays that up. I will say that we have the top part of the tree goes pretty strongly to the left, the bottom part goes strongly to the right, but just by planting it over, I don't think any of us would question that we'd want the accent over on the left side there. That almost looks fake. It is so cute. Those buds look perfect, a little crab apple. And so we have great leftward movement on that. That one's pretty straightforward. And is this a baby buckeye? That is awesome. Is this yours? That is beautiful. Buckeye. And the leaves are not going to be that small for long. If they really, that's awesome. Because some buckeye, the leaves can get giant on them. Yeah, but that looks really pretty. Which way do you see this flowing, left or right? To the right. And what are our obvious indicators of that? It's all those strong branches that go to that right side. And so this is a really good example of what do you do, again, with unusual information. The trunk comes up and then a whole bunch of stuff comes out. It's potted over on the left side of the pot, really heavy branches going over to the right. And then the apex is obviously just to the right of center. So I'd say that's a really good solution to the branches you started with on that guy. Was that collected or did you grow that from nothing or old nursery stock? How many years ago is that? 13 years ago? That's fast. No fruit yet? All right, I see a little Japanese maple tucked in there. The pot itself, the nature of the pot makes a decision about whether or not that one flows left or right. But we can see that the main trunk line and main branch by far go more right than left on that. And can I move the Pyrrhus here so we can see it a little more clearly? Whose is that? Which side is the front on this? Is this the front? Or is the other side the front? Today we're putting the flowers in front. And so which way is it flowing if we're showing it this way? This is stunning, by the way, right now. Everyone's kind of going right on this one, and that's the base of the trunk shows that. But this brings up a good point, which is when flowers are the prominent feature that you're showing off, don't hide them in the back. Don't worry about whether or not it's the front or the back. If your show was today, it would be really hard not to show it like this. Of course, you just turn your accent around the other way too. But that is fantastic. Pyrrhus are not the easiest species to work with as bonsai. Stunning, beautiful, beautiful species, but can be tricky to get them as dense as you want. All right, and maybe I'll move this Satsuki around. You can get to see, you can see that well enough. Or I guess so everyone else can see it. Which way is this one going? Is this going left or right? Some say left, some say right. That tree looks very familiar. I'd say it's going to the right. And the reason for that is the trunk starts right. You've got a nice long branch on the right. The apex kind of finishes to right. Good example of a tree with a zig-a-zag, and a zig, and yet still it ends up more zigging than zagging. I'm not sure I counted those right. But this is early enough in development where we've got the basic scaffolding for all the branches. So the next step is to essentially fill in those branch pads. And depending on how thick they get and how long they get, that's going to have a really big effect on the overall silhouette. Likewise, as the apical branches fill in, that's going to be kind of the final feature that you have to work with in developing it. And then you can tuck it over on a little bit to the left in the pot. If you did want it to go to the right, I would want to change the angle a little bit and maybe cut back some of those apical branches to kind of force it left. But I like the design to the right because I think that initial curve is one of the better features in the tree. Okay, snack time, and then we'll come back for the quiz. Yeah, whose tree is this one? Ellen's? Okay.
Yeah, she got it for you.
That's what I thought because it's one of my customers' trees. Yes, I remember it well. Cool, thank you. Break time. So I'm going to pass out 2 handouts. Take one of each. Start one on one side of the room, start one on the other. 2 different handouts. Take one of each. I'll give one to Bob too. Okay, and I will explain what to do once you all have it. Does everyone have the sheet? So for trees number 1, 2, 3, and 4, the instructions are simple. Draw in the primary branches and the silhouette, the outline of the canopy. So, things you might want to think about while doing this exercise. Is it a conifer, a deciduous tree, a broadleaf evergreen? If you see the same trunk twice, maybe one is one species, maybe one's another. Some people might find it easy to say, this is a needle juniper or a higanoki. Some might find it easy to say it's a maple or a zelkova. I don't care how bad you are at drawing because you're probably not worse than me. And I made all kinds of creative doodles that made Boone roll his eyes when we did this. So the other one I very consciously gave you for trees number 5, 6, 7, and 8. It's all the same trunk. And I wanted you to think about something for this. In general, we can create canopies that are kind of triangular or rounded. We can have branches that grow up or branches that grow down. these happen to fall into patterns. Conifers, as we've been seeing, tend to be slightly pointier. Deciduous trees tend to be slightly more round. Conifer branches are more likely to grow down. Deciduous branches are more likely to grow up. And so the idea behind having four different ones is maybe some of these are conifers for you, maybe some of those are deciduous trees. And so it gives you the opportunity to come up with one or more designs, and your controls for that would be things like the shape of the apex and the direction of the branches. But yes. So I just need like a little line drawing and the silhouette, the kind of the outline of the foliage. It can be literally just a single line on the very outside of so for instance, on this hinoki, for the primary branches, I would expect, say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 little, just a few little tiny straight lines. And then for the canopy, I would expect one line that just goes right around the outline like that. So keep it really simple. I used to do it with squiggles or lines or shading. I kind of doodled and overlapped it a whole bunch. Feel free to indulge your artistic talents or lack thereof as you see fit. Okay, I can tell by the chatter that you're all absolutely thrilled with your results. And so we did this exercise or variations of the exercise kind of 1 through 4 for years with Boone in our club, Bale and Bonsai. And Boone actually had us turn in our quizzes and he graded them all before we had the conversation. I will spare you of that. We're not doing that today. You disagree? Or are you saying that you want to score everyone's paper? No. It's between you and your bonsai gods, the results. But I want to say in general, we'll talk about the first 4 first, numbers 1 through 4. Was this easier or harder than you expected? Like, what do you think? Was it easier or harder? So then that means nothing is wrong. That's fantastic. And you came back after the break, so you get a gold star for that too. Kathy, what do you think? Was this harder or easier than you expected? Yeah. It was harder to come up with multiple designs for the same tree. Yeah. Kathleen, did you not get the second page? Oh, you did. Okay, good. Oh, well, busy drawing beautiful trees is a great excuse. Did anyone think this was easy? Paul, was this easy? You've designed a lot of trees over the years from scratch, like from tons of different starting points. Oh, interesting. And were you telling yourself that some of the trees were one kind of species or another kind of species? Actually, how many of you picked species for your trees? That'd be hard if you're brand new to bonsai to pick the species. You have no idea what the conventions are. And then how many of you did not pick the species? So how do you know what to make a tree look like if you don't know if it's a maple or a juniper? And so what comes to mind if, uh, how many of you wanted to change the trunks you had as a starting point? Did anyone add extensions to the top of the tree or, yeah, yeah, that helps. And what made you want to kind of adjust what was there? What information might have made this exercise easier? And don't include drawing skills because, again, that's always there. But so in the back, what would have made this easier? You get to choose the species. Okay, so that's a fair point. Knowing the species is a really, really strong design cue, and a lot of these really could go different ways. What about, did you have any experiences that might have made it easier, you think? And so that's one of the interesting things that comes up is often our brains just have a knee-jerk reaction or response to a given input, and that comes up a lot. Now, how many of you feel good about where you landed design-wise? And how many people feel like you're not totally satisfied? Like if I could just give you the tree that you drew, would that be wanting? You'd love for me to have any of those for you. Yeah, it'd be great. Yeah. Are you better at drawing in 3D? These days? Yeah, it's yeah. So, and this is kind of totally outside the scope of what we're talking about tonight, but I would actually argue that contemporary bonsai design is highly influenced by social media because some of the most popular approaches to designing bonsai are based on what they look like on Instagram. And that no one used the words negative space before social media because we used to look at trees in 3 dimensions. But when the start and finish of your bonsai experience is flat and 2 dimensional, negative space becomes a big percentage of the available tools that you have to play with. Whereas the thing that we used to talk about a lot more was depth, because depth is one of the most important things. It's extremely hard to draw unless you're a good artist, but it's something that's really hard to represent. So I think it's kind of easy to get the basics right in 2 dimensions, and it's really hard to get things like depth right. Almost every single time I'm doing fairly detailed work on a tree, I'll take a picture of it and look at the screen. I see the kids in Japan do this constantly when they're working on trees. It is a huge, huge tool. I actually find it frustrating to do it with my phone because it's such a wide angle lens, it kind of blows things out of proportion. But anything that lets you kind of understand what's going on with your tree, and again, follow that tip of 1/3 of the way from the top of the pot to the top of the tree. In other words, for a tree this size, I would want my eyes at this level, and I would want to be at least about this far away, maybe about this far away. And that's where I would make my kind of design decisions from that perspective. Any other perspective doesn't matter as much. And so I would pull out the phone, take a picture of that, and then you can kind of see if kind of it lights up. Now, I don't think taking a picture of your quizzes is going to make that a lot easier. Could try it. Any other information you could think you wish you had going into this that would make it easier? We could provide the species, but is there anything that you would love to go to a bonsai teacher at your next workshop or next club meeting and say, you know what would have made this easier is if I knew how to, or as I like to say instead of rules, conventions, because I typically say if there are rules in bonsai, I have yet to see the rule book. And I got in trouble for saying that once because once someone sitting in the back row of the meeting said, actually, there is a book and I wrote it, and it was Dave DeGroat, and he wrote a book called The Principles of Bonsai Design, and it's a fantastic book, and it's literally like 300 pages of conventions or rules of bonsai. Um, but other than that, yeah, there are no rules, but there are highly followed conventions, especially when we look specifically at just Japanese bonsai or just European bonsai. You'll see the kind of same conventions again and again and again. And so that can be helpful. I think Renee and I were talking at the break about, she said, well, do I really have to remember all of those things every time I'm styling a tree? And I definitely don't keep all that in mind. It's more like I feel what I want to do to a tree, but if something doesn't feel right, that's when I'll fall back on these and start considering, well, is the apex doing what I want it to? Or what if a branch or part of the tree was a little longer or shorter? And so I think of it as no more than a tool for that. Why don't we put up the first slide, and you'll see some just the ones with 1 through 4. Yeah. And so this is should probably turn off the lights in front. I kept the drawings extremely rudimentary to make you feel good about whatever you came up with. Starting with number 1, what's good or bad about what you see right there? Do you think it's a conifer or deciduous tree? Conifer, why? The branches are going down. Did any of you make it into a deciduous tree and make the branches going up? 1, 2, good. There's no reason not to. There's no reason that that couldn't be a deciduous trunk. If it were a deciduous tree, what species might it be? It could be a number of different things, kind of whatever you want. It's kind of you're more likely to see a conifer that shape, but there's no reason it couldn't be a deciduous tree. So that's a totally fine decision. Now, I'd say that one thing that doesn't come through in this super sketchy design is I would argue that that canopy is way too heavy for the trunk. And what I didn't want to draw on here is I would want tons of space between the branches, or I wouldn't want that to be one big full bowl of foliage right there. And I would want kind of gaps between the individual branches. How many of you followed the curves in the trunk for the placement of your primary branches? So for people that are new, that's a really easy kind of convention to follow, where when you have a curve, that's a very natural spot to put a branch because it's just not as natural or as graceful to see branches coming on the inside of a curve. And so at a very, very basic level, if you're designing a two-dimensional tree, placing branches on the outside of curves is a really easy way to do that. Now, how many of you added to the trunk and or made some upward primary branches? Yeah, were I more adept at making computer drawings, I would have done the same. That's totally fair. I would expect you to do that. How many of you have a shape that's radically different than what would fit within those dotted lines? Oh, so where are your lowest branches on it? So the foliage literally is just all right up there. Now, I've seen a lot of bald cypress bonsai that do that, but I've not seen many bald cypress that do that in nature. So where does that idea come from, other than, say, the one that was displayed at the expo 2 years ago? Yeah, I just don't have an answer to that one. Was it reassuring to see this basic shape, or does any of you think, oh gosh, I must have got it really wrong if you put that up there? Was anyone way different than that? Was yours fairly different? Can I peek? I'll just describe it in words to everyone else. Oh, I'd say the same basic out. I'd say if we put a dotted line around everything, you'd be in the same spot. I'd say the one way I'd characterize it is that the branches in the drawing I just looked at were all horizontal. Rather than going up or down, they were more horizontal. And that's the way, you don't see as many bonsai designed these days that way, but back in the day, a lot of trees had that really horizontal design. Now, there's one big exception to that. What kind of species did you have in mind? What kind of species typically have horizontal branches? I'd say something like, I'd say the first ones that come to mind would be Cryptomeria, needle juniper, hinoki, tend to be more upright designs with really horizontal branches. And so there actually are cases where horizontal branches are okay. We tend to think of that as a rule that you never have horizontal branches, but there's a lot of cases in which we actually can do that depending on the species. And so if you tell me that that's, say, a really highly stylized needle juniper, I'd say maybe that's an unusual trunk, but I have seen needle junipers that would have horizontal branches on a design like that. Oh, yeah, I think lots of deciduous trees could have that model. So whether or not it's literati or bunjin would have to do with essentially how many branches we put on the thing. If we were going to start with a bunjin design, there might be so one of those two low branches, but not both, and maybe one of those two upper branches and not both, and then a little bit of foliage on top, and maybe that's it. It could be a very spare or open, empty design, and you could do that. The trunk's a little too curvy for bunjin, but it's one of those towards bunjin designs or toward a literati design. Which is what I would do if I had a deciduous tree in mind. And we have all kinds of space for that when we get to 5, 6, 7, 8, when we have, 4 opportunities to design the same tree. What about number 2? What kind of tree do you think we're talking about for number 2? Trident maple. It could easily be a trident. What else? Yeah, black pine would be one of the most obvious ones. What else comes to mind for number 2? What's that? That's it, trident maple and black pine? Pretty much anything with a big trunk. Now, in general, we think of deciduous trees as having upright branch patterns, but there's plenty of examples where they go downward. You kind of get to pick and decide. Do any of you have anything radically different than the little gumdrop design on that? Like Renee, what does yours kind of resemble that or not so much? Number two, ballpark. Oh, cool. And so did you come up with a much rounder canopy on it? Any of you radically different on that one? Oh, so just padded, yeah. And so I ignored the concept of pads. I just wanted the foliage kind of within these outlines. And so that's totally fair to do that. I think that could easily be a collected tree like a juniper. That would work. Yeah. Do you like pads on deciduous trees or just on conifers? And what about broadleaf evergreen? Yeah, but not as much on the deciduous trees. Yeah, and that's a really common way to do it. A lot of conifers often. And so one way to tell whether or not you want to put pads on a tree is what role does a pad play in conveying age? If age is one of the most important things, characteristics we want to convey in bonsai, some species we actually convey age through pads better than anything. And again, interestingly, Cryptomeria hinoki and needle juniper, it's those really dense branch pads, those kind of finger-like branches that form the pads are how we convey age in those species. But they also work great for pines. They also work great for just the scale type junipers. Any ways in which you would critique that basic approach on number two? Anything look funny about it to you? Travis, is it ballpark? It's ballpark? All right. So not as controversial, number two. That one seems more or less okay. Anyone in the back? Peanut Gallery, is you on track with number two? All right. All right, what about number three? What kind of species did you come up with for number three? Flowering quince? Yep, could be a flowering quince. Cool. What? Could be a ginkgo. Though ginkgo, I'd say if they were all straight, it'd be more like ginkgo. I don't see as many soft curving designs with ginkgo. Certainly could grow like that, but they produce such straight wood. I see people do much more straight trunked compositions rather than curved trunk ginkgos. So maybe you have a nice creative ginkgo on that one. How many of you put the primary branches up on those? And then how many put the primary branches down? And so in the back, so you put the primary branches down. What species were you thinking about? Japanese maple is probably the first species that comes to mind for me when I look at that kind of a clump style maple, not unlike the maple we were looking at earlier today. Because when I see lots of trunks with a little bit of a curve to them, yeah, Japanese maple is probably the very first thing that comes to mind. But like lots of deciduous species, in terms of conifers, there's a small number of conifers I can imagine for that. I chose upward branch angles to kind of highlight the fact that it was going to be deciduous, and that's why I made kind of a broader outline for that with strong movement to the right. And then we don't really need to say a whole lot about number four since it's essentially identical to number one. The design's slightly the same, but a little bit different. One thing to play with is kind of how low the different sides of the foliar mass is. And I'd say when the branches are about the same on both sides, it makes that trunk look way too skinny. Whereas when you have one higher and one lower, I think it's a better fit for when you have a skinnier trunk like that. Which of you, I'll ask, which was your, are you the most satisfied with? Who's the most satisfied with number one on your sheet? And who's the most satisfied with number two? Who's the most satisfied with number three? And I'll skip four because it was kind of the same as number one. And so that was kind of an even mix. Do you think you were more satisfied with it because you like trees in that style or because you just had a better understanding of where to go design-wise based on your starting point? Which? The latter. And so that means it's a little harder to work with a trunk like number one that's all weird and squiggly. Yeah. I think that's true for me too. Ian, what did you think? Were you more satisfied with some than others? Uh-huh. All right, now before we switch to 5, 6, 7, 8, were all of you able to do at least one drawing for number 5, 6, 7, or 8? All right, well, let's take a peek. So what I tried to do, and by the way, this is a perfect time to say that this is actually an illustration from my new book that's coming out soon. It's so hard for me to say with a straight face, but I do have a new book coming out in April, and there is a chapter on bonsai design that happens to have some illustrations in it that look really familiar with this. And the idea is conveying that for a given trunk, you can have branches that go up and you can have branches that go down. You can have rounded canopies and you can have triangular canopies. Now, if you were going to guess, is number 1 conifer or deciduous? I'm sorry, 5. Is number 6 conifer or deciduous? Number 7 and number 8. Does conifer or deciduous make more sense for this trunk? Which do you think it is, more conifer or more deciduous? They're both perfectly equally applicable. Trident maples can be super powerful trees, and so can a lot of conifers. Do any of you see a design that's not represented here, round or pointy, upward branches, downward branches? Oh, that's a bold one. So that's actually a good point. The design I just looked like all the branches were killed off on one side of the tree, and so all of the remaining branches were going in the other direction. And that's a good way of representing a tree that's much older and or growing in a much harsher environment. And that's how the story we tell about our trees can influence the design. A little more dramatic kind of apex on it. Anyone else have something kind of totally outside of these? Again, very conventional. Oh, what'd you end up with? A cascade. And so did you just draw the trunk all the way up and then back down? And that actually totally works. It's just at a different scale like that. And then what kind of tree were you thinking of for the cascade? A what? A snow rose, a sarissa. Oh, I totally did not have that in my bingo card today. Is that your favorite one, the cascade? Ah, it's the cascade you're working on. That sounds perfect. I love it. Anyone else have something totally off the wall from these range? Yeah. Oh, let me see. Ooh, so it'd be kind of like the bottom right one if we cut off the 2 lower branches and just had more up and out starting up a little bit higher. And so that's another perfectly great way to do it. What's funny is the first time I was putting this together for the book, I was going to do 4 different trunks and I thought, wait a minute, how are you picking what's what? I thought it might be more interesting to show there's a lot of options or fewer wrong answers. And so I came up with the idea of this grid. You could go up or down, you could go round or pointy. And when I looked at it, what actually made me laugh is I thought, well, wait a minute, and I forget who is who, but that reminds me of a trident maper that Peter T. might have made. That reminds me of every tree that Walter Paul ever made. That kind of reminds me of a hornbeam that, Polish living in Spain, Mario Comsta made. And I forget who that one would have been, but every one of these, I can imagine being the exact same species, even just in the hands of different artists. And so I thought that was kind of fun. And so really the idea behind this is you get to pick pretty radically different options with your trees. You're just starting with the same starting point, and your job as a bonsai artist is typically, how are you going to decorate or adorn the trunk with foliage? Perfect. Well, that's about all I had on that. Any questions about this exercise? The only other thing I was going to say about it is that this is actually a great way to teach yourself design. What you can do is pick up any bonsai book, trace the trunks of any trees that you like or even don't like, and then you can practice drawing different branches and canopies on them. And it's a great way to kind of home in on what kind of designs you do or don't like. Well, I'm happy to hear that. Thanks so much. But that's all I've got for you today. So thank you all very much.